how's it going, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we're going to go ahead and continue our archetype breakdown for our Ikoria Lair of Behemoths. A very interesting set, focused on some 3-color combinations, but also the 2-color pairs within those 3-color combinations. It was really hard to figure out what the archetypes were for this set. It's not as straightforward as the typical set, but if you haven't already, check out the first video on the Keyword Matters archetypes, where we went over 5 of the ally color archetypes that care about a specific keyword. That was a pretty long video, but we did cover 5 archetypes, whereas in this video, we're only going to cover basically 2, and we're going to try to keep it shorter for most of the rest of the videos until we cover all of the main archetypes in the set. I don't have actually a planned out number of videos for this series as I normally would, because it seems like there's probably more than 10 straightforward archetypes here, or maybe less, who knows. But anyway, if you are enjoying this series or you're getting anything out of it, if it's been informative, entertaining, anything, feel free to subscribe below. And if not, that's cool. We're just hanging out. Also, you can find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. This time, we're going to be talking about Cyclone and the Spells Matters archetype. You know, the blue-red, typical instant sorcery matters archetype that we get in a lot of sets. But we are going to focus most of our attention on the Cyclone deck, which happens to be in Jeskai colors. Now, I want to be transparent here. I want to not mislead anybody. The way this set was designed, again, there are 3-color combinations, but most of the decks are 2-color decks, or at least the archetypes are focused on 2-color decks, and there just happen to be 3-color things going on. The Cyclone deck is primarily a red-white deck. You'll notice when we get to the uncommons that most of the uncommons that care about Cyclone, if not all of them, are red-white cards, but there are also random blue cards that care about Cyclone in this set. So it didn't seem right to say that the Cyclone deck was just straightforward red-white deck and leave the blue cards out, because they do fit into this deck. And again, you will have the option of drafting 3-color decks, which if you're in the Cyclone deck, you might be enticed by some of the blue cards. But as with previous videos and the way we're just going to do this moving forward, we're going to go ahead and look at the rares first, so that would really push you into a Cycling Matters deck. The first one, and in my opinion the best one, and that's debatable, the next card is going to be very good as well, but debatably the best Cyclone payoff you have in this set is Rael, the Everwise. It is 1 blue-red for a 0/3 human wizard. It's a legendary mythic, and it gets +1/+0 for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, which matters for the Cyclone deck because you'll just naturally be cycling cards away into your graveyard, and a lot of them are going to be instants and sorceries, but that's going to matter more for the second archetype we talk about towards the end of this video. The part we care about is the ability that says whenever you discard 1 or more cards for the first time each turn, draw that many cards. And clearly this was designed with Cyclone in mind. What this means is whenever you cycle, as long as that's the first time you're discarding that turn, you will draw 2 cards off your cycler. And remember, a lot of the Cyclone cards in this set are super cheap to cycle. Back in Amonkhet, you would expect 2 or 3 mana for most cyclers, or at least 1 colored mana. Most of the cyclers in this set are just 1 or 2 generic colored mana, so it's not that hard to find cyclers. And with Rael, you can turn every single cycler into multiple extra cards. So think about it, a single mana to cycle a card and then you draw 2 cards. It's just really easy to net cards. So Rael is the type of card that if I had it in my pool, yes, I'm going to go for the Cyclone deck. I'm going to try to be red-white because that's where most of the payoffs are, but I'm going to get that blue mana in there so that I can get paid off with Rael. And another thing to note about this card is that it works on every player's turn. So in the case of 1 versus 1 limited, you can cycle a card on your turn, trigger the ability, get an extra card off of it, and you can cycle on your opponent's turn and effectively just net cards on every single player's turn, since it counts the first card you discard on each turn, not just each of your turns. The other Cyclone payoff, and again, it's debatable which of these is better. The Unpredictable Cyclone really asks that you have good cards in your deck, but that's not asking too much, right? Unpredictable Cyclone is 3 red for a rare enchantment. It has Cyclone itself for 2 mana, and it's always nice when the payoffs have Cyclone, which we'll see on a couple of the other cards, because it means if you are just behind and you don't have time to pay 5 mana to just put an enchantment on board and not affect the board, you can cycle and look for something else. Or early in the game, if you're missing land drops, it's always nice to have the option to cycle, even though this is one of the cards that you ideally want to win with in your heavy Cyclone deck. So you're going to be hesitant to cycle it, but sometimes it's the right thing to do. Anyway, when this enchantment is on board, it says, if a Cyclone ability of another non-land card would cause you to draw a card, instead, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a card that shares a card type with the cycled card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then put the exiled cards that weren't cast on the bottom in a random order, blah, blah, blah. All that usual stuff, right? So just to dumb this down, if you cycle a sorcery, instead of drawing a card, you get to dig through your deck until you hit the next sorcery and cast that for free. If you cycle a creature, which is what you ideally want to be doing with this card, you just get to cycle through your deck until you hit the next creature that pops up and you cast it for free. Now, what this means is, yeah, you might be cycling a 6-drop creature from your deck that you would like to cast at some point in the game, but you're only going to pay 1 or 2 mana for the Cyclone ability, and then you're just going to get a free creature from your deck, and hopefully it costs more than 1 or 2 mana. So yes, this might turn 5-drop sorceries into 5-drop sorceries. It might not actually, turn your card into a better card, but the thing is, you're turning the Cyclone ability into an extra card. So you're getting free cards for extremely cheap prices, and you can do this at instant speed. So if your opponent's attacking you, they have to be wary because you could just cycle a creature and then essentially flash out a creature for just 1 or 2 mana, and it could be something huge, it could be something small. A lot of your payoffs are little small creatures, but you are probably ideally going to have some big creatures in your deck too. And aptly named, right? Unpredictable. You don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it's a fun card. It seems like it's going to be a powerful card in a deck that just has tons and tons of cyclers. And if I were playing this card, I would look to draft some of the expensive creatures with Cyclone, because not only are those cheap to cycle, but they're also good hits for the unpredictable Cyclone. Now, a couple other cards here. Not all of these directly care about Cyclone, but they are going to be good in a Cyclone deck. The first one is Zerta, the Dawn Waker. This is your Boros companion, and very clearly this was designed with Cyclone in mind. It is 1 and double red-white mana, so 3 mana total. 2 of it has to be red and or white. Hybrid mana always helps, especially if you end up in 3-color decks. It is a 3/3, so right off the bat, you've got a 3 mana 3/3. It's a rare Elemental Fox legendary, and it's got a companion ability, but that's not something that I'm going to put a lot of credence into because this is a card that you would just play in your deck. But for completionist's sake, we'll read the companion clause. It says, if each permanent card in your deck has an activated ability, keep in mind, Cyclone is an activated ability, then you can have this as your companion, which means it can sit in your sideboard, and you can cast it from your sideboard at least once per game, right? Now, we're going to ignore that, right? Don't go out of your way to make sure all of the permanents in your deck have activated abilities, or at least don't keep a really good card in your sideboard or not play a really good card in your main board because you have Zerta. Just play your good cards, and if it happens to work out, then you can have Zerta as a companion. If it doesn't, just play Zerta in your deck, and it's going to be just as good. Now, when Zerta is in play, you play your 3 mana 3/3. It says abilities you activate that aren't main abilities cost 2 less to activate, but the effect can't reduce that mana to less than 1, right? And what this means is you can cycle all of your cards for 2 less mana. Now, all of your 1 mana cyclers are still going to cost 1, but all your 2 and 3 mana cyclers now cost basically 1 mana, and you can just chain together cyclers extremely quickly. Zerta is a kind of a cool card. It is just a generically powerful card. It does incentivize you to look for other activated abilities because it works for Cyclone, but it works for other activated abilities as well. And it itself has the activated ability for 1 mana, tap it, target creature can't block this turn. So it has kind of a relevant on-board ability as well. Very powerful card, definitely worth first picking. Maybe not as good as just a strong, efficient removal spell, but an interesting card, and I would look to pick up some cyclers if I had Zerta in my deck. There's also Shark Typhoon, which we could mention this later in the video as well. In fact, it's probably better in the blue-red spells deck than it actually is in the Cyclone deck. And note that this card doesn't actually care about Cyclone in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't give you a benefit for Cyclone, but it has Cyclone itself, and it creates a creature when you cycle it. We saw this card previously. This is just a powerful card in general because of the Cyclone ability. It's a little more niche to have the actual create multiple Sharks ability in your Spells Matters deck, but a lot of times you'll end up cycling this as a surprise flash flyer that will also draw you a card because you cycled it. And there's also Yadarra, which is similar to Shark Typhoon in that it's not necessarily like a huge Cyclone payoff. It just happens to be a rare that's worth talking about and that has a good effect on the board, and it just so happens to have Cyclone. Now, this card has some wonky text that if you've cycled Yadarra 4 times in the same game, you get to just put it on the battlefield the last time you cycle it, but unless you have multiple copies of this somehow, that's not really happening, and this card is just gigantic, so it's here more as a nod to the fact that it's just a good, powerful creature when you cast it, rather than the fact that it has Cyclone. But again, Cyclone makes every card better, especially expensive cards, because sometimes you don't get to cast your expensive cards, and being able to do something with them is quite nice. That moves us into our lower rarity cards for the Cyclone deck. Again, we're going to look at basically everything in the Jeskai deck that cares about Cyclone, either pays you off or helps you cycle. We're not going to look at every single card with Cyclone, but we're going to look at the actual payoffs here. So we're going to kick things off with a couple of the uncommons. The first one is Flourishing Fox. It's a single white mana for a 1/1 uncommon fox, and it says whenever you cycle another card, put a +1/+1 counter on Flourishing Fox, and it itself has Cyclone for a single mana. You'll see that a lot. We saw that with the Unpredictable Cyclone, but a lot of the actual Cyclone payoffs in this set have Cyclone themselves, which is just huge. It means your entire deck, for the most part, is very synergistic. Either you have the payoffs on board and the rest of your Cyclone cards work for them, or you have payoffs and you don't need the additional payoffs, so you can use those to fuel the payoffs you already have, or you can use your payoffs to cycle and find certain cards. The consistency of a Cyclone deck that cares about finding specific cards is a lot higher than your average deck, because Cyclone just means you get to dig through your deck and find certain cards a lot faster. Now, Flourishing Fox is a reasonable payoff, but it's the type of card that you want it on turn 1, and it gets a lot worse every turn after that you draw, right? If you have this on turn 1 and you can spend the entire rest of the game just cycling cards, you might just be able to win off of like a single Flourishing Fox or a card or two, right? You can turbo out Cyclone cards pretty easily in this set. So a turn 1 Fox can turn into a 3/3, 4/4, 5/5 pretty quickly and start beating down. But of course, the downside is that sometimes you don't draw it on turn 1 and it gets a lot worse. There's also Valiant Rescuer. This is 1 and a white for a 3/1 uncommon human soldier, and it says whenever you cycle another card for the first time each turn, create a 1/1 human soldier token. It itself has Cyclone for 2 mana. Again, just nice to have Cyclone on your already playable Cyclone Matters cards. Now, this one's a little bit weird because there are human matter strategies in this set. There's Cyclone in every single color, so don't expect to get rewarded with this card. Don't expect to wheel it, whereas you might wheel something like Flourishing Fox. There are some white decks that don't care about Cyclone, so they will probably not take the Flourishing Fox, but you will probably never wheel a Valiant Rescuer. Not only is it just a fine vanilla creature, but there are decks that care about making tokens, and Valiant Rescuer will fit that bill as well as fit the Cyclone bill. So it will be a card that bridges the gap between multiple archetypes, meaning you need to pick it up when you see it or you're probably not going to get it. This card is really good. Can you imagine just going turn 1 Flourishing Fox, turn 2 Valiant Rescuer, and then you just start cycling? You're going to build up a huge board, huge creatures, and your opponent's not going to be able to keep up with that curve, or at least they're going to have something special to kind of combat it. Valiant Rescuer is limited to once per turn, but again, same as Rael, this is not each of your turns, it's each turn. So you can cycle once on your turn to make a soldier, you can cycle once on your opponent's turn to make a soldier, and it does fit the bill for any human synergies you might have in your deck. Rudin Millock is a really cool card. It's 4 and a red for a 4/4 uncommon lizard, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, exile target card with a Cyclone ability from your graveyard. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. And the Millock, again, has Cyclone itself for 2 mana, which is pretty sweet. So one of the things about Cyclone decks, or one of the things about cycling all of your cards and just continuing to cycle, is that you end up flooding out a decent amount. You end up cycling away actual spells, which means you're going to draw cards, and you're going to draw lands a decent amount of the cards, or a decent amount of the time, right? So if all you are doing is cycling, you end up actually losing a bunch of your spells, which could feel bad, right? You don't want to cycle your Unpredictable Cyclone, but sometimes you have to. Sometimes you just need to find some action. Sometimes you don't have the time to just cast your Cyclone. You need to find a land drop, or you're falling behind. You need to look for specific answers. And it feels bad, but sometimes it's worth it to cycle away your big late game creature or your big late game spell. Rudin Millock makes up for that by saying, hey, it's okay to cycle away that spell because I'm going to give you the option to recast it later in the game. It's kind of like a temporary regrowth type effect, right? A card that would say, put an instant or sorcery from your graveyard back into your hand. Well, Rudin Millock does that kind of. It gives you a small window to cast that card. You do have to cast it by the end of your next turn, or it's permanently exiled. And again, the Millock just has Cyclone itself, and 5 mana 4/4 is not embarrassing. So I really do like this card as a form of card advantage for the Cyclone deck. Note that Cyclone is not typically card advantage. You discard a card, you draw a card. That is card parity, but the Rudin Millock actually gives you card advantage off of its enter the battlefield trigger. Next up is a card we talked about in the trample subset of the last video, Reptilian Reflection. 2 and a red for an uncommon enchantment, and whenever you cycle a card, you may have the enchantment become a 5/4 dinosaur creature with trample and haste in addition to its other types until end of turn. Not a bad card, definitely not the best payoff here, but not the worst either. If you play this on turn 3, or God forbid you get multiples, you do have the option to just turn this into a 5/4 pretty regularly, and those are pretty good stats on a 3 mana card. It does require that you're cycling in order to be useful. If somehow this is the last card in your hand, you just play it out, and you end up not drawing extra cyclers, this card doesn't do anything. So it's a little bit more finicky. It does not actually have Cyclone like a lot of the other payoffs here, but it does seem like if you're in a devoted Cyclone deck, that this is a card that you would probably be happy to run. Savai Thundermane is one of our gold uncommons. It is red-white for a 3/2 uncommon elemental cat, and this one is very powerful. It says whenever you cycle a card, you may pay 2 mana. If you do, Savai Thundermane deals 2 damage to target creature, and you gain 2 life. So a little bit interesting that this can't hit your opponent, but you get to throw around shocks. Every single cycle you do, you get to pay 2 mana to shock something, and you gain 2 life. So this gives you time, right? What you really want to do is turn Cyclone into an onboard advantage, and the Thunderbane does that. Plus, this is a 2 mana 3/2, which I might not have even mentioned because the ability is so good. So you've got a good static creature on 2 mana that pays you off for Cyclone. A lot of times, that's your whole game plan. You stick this on board and you just cycle, right? Once you get to 6 mana, you can cycle multiple 1 mana cyclers and start dealing 2 damage to multiple creatures per turn, and it really gets out of hand. Plus, you gain life, so if your opponent's attacking you, you've got a little bit of a buffer there to just continue enacting your game plan and basically ignore what your opponent's doing. This doesn't turn into a win con by itself because it can't hit your opponent, but it is a powerful removal spell and repeated removal spell at that for your opponent's creatures if you're in a heavy Cyclone deck. The next one is about as dedicated to Cyclone as you can get, but can turn into an actual win con. This is Zenith Flare, or Zenith Flare. 2 red-white for an uncommon instant. Zenith Flare deals X damage to any target, and you gain X life, where X is the number of cards with a Cyclone ability in your graveyard. So the real question here is, can you get 20 Cyclone cards in your graveyard? Because if you can, Zenith Flare just kills your opponent, right? This is an uncommon that can just kill your opponent, basically fireball him out of the game. And if not, it can always deal with a creature as well. But I don't know if those decks are going to exist. There is a lot of Cyclone in this set. You can always play off-color cyclers, which we'll talk about. But if you are just cycling, or you're milling yourself, or you can manage to get a reasonably large amount of Cyclone cards into your graveyard, then Zenith Flare is your game plan. It is your finisher. Obviously, you want to supplement it by actually dealing some other forms of damage to your opponent, so get some early attacks in. Just use some of the commons that we'll talk about here in a second to push in a little bit of damage, and then use Zenith Flare to finish it off. One interesting thing about Zenith Flare is that it doesn't do anything at all if you don't have cyclers, similar to the Reptilian Reflection. So there are some people at the table who will not be interested in this card, and it does have a small chance of wheeling, even though I do expect the Cyclone deck to be ubiquitous enough and popular enough that I don't think you should be trying to wheel Zenith Flares early on in the format. And moving right along, we've talked about all of the red-white cards so far. Let's go ahead and talk about the 2 blue cards that stand out as Cyclone payoffs. The first one is quite obviously a Cyclone payoff. It is Escape Protocol, 1 in a blue for an uncommon enchantment. Whenever you cycle a card, you may pay a mana. If you do, exile target artifact or creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So it's always nice to have the option to keep blinking one of your own creatures, and if you can pick up a good enter the battlefield trigger, this is really nice tool to just keep using that enter the battlefield trigger over and over again. The thing is, there aren't a lot of enter the battlefield effects in this set. Due to Mutate and Mutate kind of taking up a lot of the space that ETBs would normally take up, there's only a couple reasonable enter the battlefield effects. The only one that really comes to mind is Frostlinks, which is a fine card, but not really like busted if you keep blinking it, right? Escape Protocol is more of a way to kind of protect your creatures or save your own creatures from removal spells. If your opponent goes to target one of your creatures, you cycle a card and then you pay a mana and blink it, and your creature is now safe, right? It's a little bit weird to have this in a set that has Mutate as well, because if you mutate onto a creature and then you end up blinking your creature that is mutated, the entire stack of creatures will leave the battlefield and then come back to the battlefield as separate objects, which is a little bit weird. This is not really a card I would go out of my way to splash in a red-white dedicated Cyclone deck, but if you end up with good enter the battlefield effects, or you happen to be a blue deck with good enter the battlefield effects with a number of decent cyclers, then Escape Protocol could do some work. But this is not really the one that I'm looking to splash. The one that I am looking to splash, or maybe the one that I need to see in action but strikes me as a pretty good card, is Ominous Seas. 1 in a blue for an uncommon enchantment. It says whenever you draw a card, put a foreshadow encounter on Ominous Seas. Okay, you can remove 8 foreshadow counters from Ominous Seas to create an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token. And notice you don't have to sacrifice the Ominous Seas. It still sits on board. You can still generate more foreshadow tokens, and then you can make presumably another 8/8, maybe 2, but you've probably already won the game if you made 2 8/8s. The thing is, this card has Cyclone for 2 generic mana. So if you splash this and you don't have your blue mana, or you are missing one of your main colors, you can always cycle it away, right? Or if you don't have this on turn 2 and you draw it on turn 10 and you're just not going to be able to draw 8 extra cards that game, then you just cycle it away and find some other form of action. But if you have this card on turn 2 and you can just keep yourself alive, this card can be quite good, right? If you are able to cycle a card every turn, let's just say you are able to cycle 1 card per turn from turn 3 onwards after you play this, that means every 4 turns you are going to make an 8/8, which is a very powerful effect when you only paid 2 mana initially, right? Now, this is not a 2 mana 8/8, it is a 2 mana 8/8 that can't really do anything for a while, right? You don't get to attack and block with this. You kind of just have to wait. But if you can supplement this card with actual Cyclone cards, it gets a lot better. I don't think this is a card you play if you don't have Cyclone in your deck. Although, again, it has Cyclone itself, and Cyclone just makes everything better. So Ominous Seas is definitely the better of the 2 blue payoffs here. Escape Protocol is neat, but I don't see it being a big contender for limited. And now moving into the commons, we have a mirrored pair, Drenith Healer and Drenith Stinger. These are both 1 and either white or red. There's a 2 mana 2/2 in each of these colors. So you get 2 mana 2/2, and they have kind of opposite abilities. The white one says whenever you cycle another card, you gain a life. The red one, and the better one for sure, says whenever you cycle another card, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and they both have Cyclone for a single mana. So they're both bears, 1 in white, 1 in red. 1 gives you life when you cycle, 1 deals damage to your opponent when you cycle. Obviously, you would rather have the red one, because that means you can turn your cyclers into an actual game plan. If you go turn 2 Stinger, turn 3 Stinger, and you just cycle, you might be able to use that as a win con, whereas if you just play the white ones, you're going to keep yourself alive a little bit longer, but you're not actually doing anything to actually kill your opponent, right? The Stinger is what you want with your Zenith Flare, because you can use the Stinger to deal damage to your opponent, and then the Zenith Flare to finish them off. That by itself seems like a pretty good strategy. The Healer, probably a card you would play in your Cyclone deck, but that's because it has Cyclone. It's definitely the lesser of the 2, but still an option you have for this deck. And then finally, there's this random monkey, the Prickly Marmoset, 2 in a red for a 2/3 common monkey with first strike. So 3 mana 2/3 first strike, solid vanilla creature on its own, but it has some Cyclone upside. It says whenever you cycle a card, Prickly Marmoset gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And that is actually a pretty strong ability to have on a first striker, because it's a nice threat of activation thing, right? If your opponent goes to block this and you have mana up, you have cards in your hand, you could cycle and just turn this into a powerful first striker that's going to knock off anything that blocks it. But at the same time, if they don't block, you can presumably cycle 2 or 3 cards and give this a trigger for each card you cycle. Prickly Marmoset has the potential to just kill your opponent in a one-shot, right? If you can go cycle, 4 cycles in the same turn, this thing will get +8/+0 and just dome your opponent if they don't block it. But they also have to respect the fact that they could just lose a creature if they do block it. So it seems like a nice threat of activation effect, kind of a random common creature for this archetype, but one that's worth mentioning nonetheless. Now, I wanted to go ahead and just take a moment to talk about some of the cards that I think are the best as far as Cyclone goes. Keep in mind, when you're building a Cyclone deck, you can play off-color cards as long as they have Cyclone, right? You can splash for a lot of different things. You're a little bit more flexible in what you can do because the cards you can't cast have Cyclone, so you can always ditch them if it's not the right time to cast them. So sideboard cards, off-color cards, things like that, they're a lot better in this archetype than there would be in anything else because you still get a card out of them no matter what's going on. But I did want to mention the cards that I think are the best of the best when it comes to actual cards with Cyclone. The first 3 I wanted to talk about, and I won't spend long on these, are the white, blue, and red part of the cycle that gives an ability when you cycle the creature. The reason these are here is not because they have Cyclone, but because they're just solid creatures when you cast them, and on top of that, happen to have Cyclone, right? They each give an ability when you cycle them. The white one gives lifelink, the blue one gives fly-in, the red one gives first strike. You can do this stuff at instant speed and use them as pseudo combat tricks, but when you cast these creatures, they have pretty strong effects on the game, and those are the best cyclers, are cards that do something early, but if you happen to get to the point where you cast them on curve, they're actually quite strong. That's very apparent with the red one, the Sanctuary Smasher, which is a 6/4 first striker. Very powerful creature once it resolves, but sometimes you don't have the luxury of waiting to 6 mana, and you can always cycle it away for a little bit of value. Same goes for Avian, Oddity, Splendor Mare. These are just solid creatures that you can cast, but if it's better to cycle them, you have that option. So these are probably the top tier cyclers that you're looking for at lower rarities. On top of that, there's also Lava Serpent, which stuck out to me as just, again, another big beater type creature. Not as good as Sanctuary Smasher, but when you cast a 6 mana 5/5 haste, that has a real effect on the board, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it's good because 6 mana is not quite a good deal for that. But when you do cast it, you're going to get something out of it. This is a good top-end card for an aggro deck because you can always cycle it away, and it gives you something to do with your mana in your aggro deck if you happen to be drawing too many lands. There's also Boon of the Wishgiver, which seems like possibly the best uncommon Cyclone card in the set. It's just very simply 6 mana sorcery, draw 4 cards, which is an extremely powerful ability, especially in a control mirror or a very slow matchup. But again, this is not a card that you have the luxury of casting too often against super aggressive decks or beatdown decks, so giving it a cheap Cyclone option is very nice as well. There's Neutralize, 1 blue for an instant that counters target spell, but you can cycle it for 2 mana. Cycling on counter spells is always nice as well, because sometimes your opponent is savvy to the fact that you have a counter spell, or they don't need to play into it, and they just don't cast anything, which means your counter spell is stuck in your hand. Giving it Cycling means that you can always do something with it if your opponent is playing around it. There's Go for Blood, which is basically Prey Upon, sorcery speed fight spell for 1 in a red. And if you look back at this video, there aren't a lot of huge creatures, but sometimes it's nice to have a removal spell in your deck regardless. And it's nice that that removal spell is situational but has Cyclone, right? Because sometimes you can't use this to actually kill something you want to kill, or you're going to have to 2-for-1 yourself, and that's just not really worth it. So you can always cycle it away. And then finally, there's 2 other mana fixin' cards that were worth talking about here. Raugrin Triome and Raugrin Crystal are mana fixers with Cyclone. There's actually a incomplete cycle of Cyclone lands here. Same goes for the crystals. And while you would play these if you're not all 3 colors, and you would even play some off-color ones if they were only 1 or 2 of your colors, they are very strong additions. Raugrin Triome is probably the best card you can get for a full-on Jeskai Cyclone deck due to A, having Cyclone, and B, just making sure your mana is going to work out for your splash cards. The Crystal is a little bit less so. I would err on the side of not trying to play the Crystal as my only mana fixing options, but it is nice that if you happen to draw all of your islands, mountains, and plains and you don't need the Crystal, you can cycle it away, which works very well in this strategy. And that's going to move us into the second archetype, which will be much quicker because it's basically just 2-color pair with a couple cards to talk about, and that is the blue-red Spells Matters archetype. This seemed like a very good pairing to go with the Cyclone deck because they overlap a lot. They're going to want a lot of the same decks, but the actual blue-red archetype, as opposed to the red-white Cyclone deck with some blue Spells Matters cards in it, the blue-red deck cares about casting non-creature spells, cares about having non-creature spells in the graveyard, so on and so forth. So it doesn't necessarily care about Cyclone as much, but it will obviously play some of those Cyclone Matters cards. And we already talked about Rael, but here, in addition to having the Cyclone payoff, you do care a lot more about that first ability that gives it +1/+0 for each instant or sorcery in your graveyard. Presumably, this deck is going to have tons of instants and sorceries, and it's not inconceivable for Rael to be something like a 5/3 or 6/3, which happens to be a really big beater. Not quite a Crackling Drake or an Enigma Drake. You usually want cards like this to have flying, but it will trade off for something while giving you advantage up until that point. There's also Lutri the Spell Chaser, which is your Izzet companion. It's 1 and double blue-red hybrid mana, so 3 mana total for a 3/4 flash creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you may copy an instant or sorcery that you control on the stack, which is a really nice ability, right? If you have a cheap removal spell and you can flash in Lutri while your spell is on the stack, you get to double up on that spell while also getting a 3/2 flash creature on board, which is quite nice. Plus, Lutri has the benefit of having a companion clause that is actually achievable in Limited. It says each non-land card in your starting deck has a different name. So as long as you have no copies of non-land cards in your deck, you always have access to Lutri in your sideboard, and you can pick and choose when the time is right to flash it in and copy one of your own spells. Now, moving on to the uncommons, we have Sprite Dragon, which is blue-red for a 1/1 uncommon fairy dragon with flying and haste, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Sprite Dragon. Starts off pretty wimpy, but once you get the first counter on it, it's worth the investment of 2 mana, and once you get beyond that point, it actually gets kind of out of control. Plus, note that some of these cards are non-creature spell, not just instant or sorcery. In this case, Sprite Dragon has basically permanent prowess. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets bigger. Play this on turn 2, follow up with a bunch of instants or sorceries, and you have a game plan on your hands. Similar to the Fox we talked about for the Cyclone deck, this card does drop off a little bit later in the game if you don't have it on turn 2, but the turn 2 Sprite Dragon should be something that your opponent should watch out for. There's Channeled Force, which is not a card I care too much for, but it is here. It is an Izzet uncommon, so we're going to talk about it. It's 2 blue-red for an instant, and again, uncommon. As an additional cost to cast it, discard X cards. Target player draws X cards, and then Channeled Force deals X damage to up to 1 target creature or planeswalker. So if you discard, let's say, 3 other cards when you cast this, you get to draw 3 cards and then deal 3 damage to your opponent. So it's basically like a mini wheel effect. You get to wheel away whatever cards you want, and you get to turn those cards into damage against any target, or rather any creature or planeswalker. I do not like this card because if you top deck it or you only have 1 other card in your hand, it doesn't really do anything, right? It's basically deal 1 damage to a creature, discard your card, and then replace it with something else. I do not like this card very much at all. Plus, I don't really want to discard a bunch of spells just to put a bunch of spells in the graveyard for other cards. So, I don't know. It has the potential, of course, there are some highs with this card where you have 7 other cards in your hand, and you get to wheel it and deal 7 to a creature, and you get to draw a whole new hand. Plus, it's a good way to use up extra lands that you have held on to for a couple of turns, but it seems pretty weak in general due to the fact that it does have just an extremely low of doing absolutely nothing if it's the only card in your hand. So I would look for more reliable removal spells, less conditional spells that don't require you to have a bunch of cards in your hand. Plus, if you have a bunch of cards in your hand, let's be real, you're probably doing fine in your Spells Matters deck. Next up, Lord Draxus, 1 blue-red for a 2/3 uncommon lizard beast with Mutate. The Mutate cost is double blue-red mana, so any combination of 2 blue and or red mana. And it says whenever this creature mutates, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Now this is a pretty cheap mutate cost. That means you can mutate this onto something else. You will often put it underneath because 2/3 is probably weaker than most of the things you're mutating onto, but it'll get you a spell back, which is exactly what this archetype wants to be doing. It wants to be using the same spells over and over again. Ideally, you get a draw spell or a removal spell back, and you just get value off of the Draxus. Plus, you can continue to mutate onto the Draxus if you want to get spells back. This is a way to loop the same spell over and over again if you have that option. Plus, the mutate cost is flexible, so you don't even necessarily have to be blue-red to play this card if you want to mutate it in another deck. Seems like the perfect kind of payoff for blue-red, although you do have to find something that you want to mutate onto, right? You do usually end up putting yourself in a position to get 2 for 1 when you mutate, which we'll talk about more in a separate video. So just keep that in mind. You need to make sure the spell you're getting back is worth the possibility that you get 2 for 1 when you mutate the Draxus. And finally, as far as uncommons go, there's Blitz of the Thunder Raptor. This is 1 in a red for an uncommon instant, and it deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the number of instants or sorceries in your graveyard, and it exiles that creature if it dies that turn. This is a really tricky removal spell, and I'm actually leaning on the side of saying that this is not going to be that good in the format. You need to be very heavy on instants and sorceries, or you need to be cycling just a ton. This card might actually be better in the red-white Cyclone deck because you can't cast this on turn 2, right? How many instants and sorceries do you have in your graveyard typically on turn 2, turn 3, turn 4? Not a lot, right? Maybe 1 or 2, which means the Blitz on turn 4 or 5 is probably dealing 2 or 3 damage. If you are all in on spells, this card gets better. And it's the type of spell where you're not meant to cast it on turn 2. You cast it on turn 5 or 6, and then you double spell that turn. But it is situational enough that I don't think it's going to be that good, or at least when it is good, it's going to be good, but it's also going to be unreliably good, where sometimes you just don't have enough instants and sorceries in your graveyard to make it do what you want it to do. Moving on, talking about some of the commons for the Spell Matters archetype, we have Pyroceratops, which is basically a retread of Pyrehound from previous sets. It is 3 in a red for a 2/3 common elemental dinosaur. It has trample, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Pyroceratops. This sort of card has always been pretty decent. The card that just grows as you cast spells. Think Spellgorger Weird from War of the Spark. Think Pyrehound from Eldritch Moon or Shadows over Innistrad. It's always been fine, right? You do need to get the train rolling, though. You need to get counters on it, and it takes up your 4th turn with a pretty dorky creature. But once you start casting spells and growing this thing, it has trample, so it pushes in pretty hard. You only really need 1 counter before this becomes just a decent creature, so it's not too hard to play this on turn 4 and then turn 5 cast something that turns it into a 3/4, and it has the potential to get way bigger than that. Trample means that it's not getting chump blocked once it gets past the point of no return as well. So Pyrehound seems, or rather Pyroceratops, seems like a good addition to this deck. There's also Blister Spit Gremlin, which is much, much worse. It's a single red mana for a 1/1 common gremlin, and for a mana you can tap it to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, untap it. So this is not Two-Headed Giant that we're focused on here. If you're playing Two-Headed Giant, Blister Spit Gremlin is the truth, but this is mostly geared towards 1v1, where this card is just too slow. The mana that you have to actually use to activate this ability is not worth it. The 1/1 body doesn't block as cards like this typically do. Think things like Lobber Crew or Thermo Alchemist or Brimstone Trebuchet from Eldraine, right? Those cards were decent blockers that got to sit back and do this, and they didn't have mana requirements, whereas Blister Spit Gremlin does. So not the card that I'm looking for here, but we wanted to make sure we mentioned it. Spell Eater Wolverine is 2 in a red for a 3/2 common Wolverine, and it has double strike as long as there are 3 or more instants or sorcery cards in your graveyard. Again, this doesn't mean you have to cast 3 instants or sorceries. You can also cycle cards away, and there is some surprise factor too, where you attack with this while you only have 2 instants or sorceries in your graveyard, and then you get to cycle 1 at instant speed and give it surprise double strike. Very similar to the monkey that we saw, which has threat of activation type effect. This one is a little bit harder to just get online because you will probably need to actually cast some number of those instants or sorceries, but it did seem like a decent common that has the potential to get out of hand in the Spell Matters deck. And then I wanted to talk about some of the Jeskai cards that you would be willing to go out of your way to play 3 colors for in the Spells Matters deck. First off, there's Narset, which is 3 mana, or rather 4 mana, 3 of which is Jeskai colors for a 4 loyalty Planeswalker. It's a mythic, obviously, and it says +1, you gain 2 life, and you add blue, red, or white mana to your mana pool, but you can only cast non-creature spells with that mana, which you are probably a deck full of non-creature spells, so gaining a little bit of life and giving yourself a little bit of mana to cast those spells seems nice. You can also -2 to draw a card, and then you have the choice to discard a card, and if you discard a non-land card, you get to deal damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the CMC of that card. So this is a little bit of an awkward card advantage, right? Because you can -2 and just keep the card, and then yes, you drew a card. But if you want to go ahead and turn this into actual advantage, you have to discard a card from your hand to deal damage to something. So you basically get to loot, but then you have to discard an actual spell to deal damage to a creature, and it can't go to your opponent's face, which is probably for the best, right? Seems like a fine ability, but -in to get your card advantage is not exactly where you want to be with a Planeswalker, so the +1's looking like the real deal here, but the -2 can still pick off a creature. And then the -6, which is achievable here, +1/+1 -6, not too hard to do, says you get an emblem with, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this emblem deals 2 damage to any target. So that's a emblem that should win you the game in any reasonable fashion, as long as you're casting spells and you're not completely dying. But I mentioned this when the card was spoiled. Narset is a completely fair 3-color Planeswalker. It had the potential to be way more busted for 3 colors, but it is fair. It's kind of hard to protect. It doesn't really give you a board presence when it's on board, and the emblem doesn't immediately win the game. It takes a little bit more work. So if you're able to stick this on a board and protect it, it's going to have a meaningful effect, but it's not exactly one of the bomb rare planeswalkers that you're looking for. You will definitely still play it in your Spells Matters deck. Next up is Vadrik, Apex of Thunder. This is Jeskai mana, so blue, red, white for a 3/3 mythic legendary elemental dinosaur cat, which is a really weird thing to say. It has mutate for 1 mana, 1 colorless mana, 2 red mana, and a hybrid blue or white mana. So 4 mana total, 1 of which has to be blue or white, 2 of which has to be red. And it has flying and first strike. So already 3 mana, 3/3, flying, first strike, mutate, all a very strong package, but it has this non-creature spell clause that says whenever it mutates, you may cast target non-creature spell with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. Also note, it does not exile that spell, so you can keep casting the same spell every time this thing mutates. It is just a good way to get a cheap, efficient spell back from your graveyard, hopefully a removal spell, possibly a draw spell, something that gives you some sort of advantage, and you get a nice creature on top of it. This is a good card to just cast on turn 3 if you're able to do it, and then continue mutating onto it to get some sort of advantage. But yeah, your Spell Matters deck is going to splash for this because, hey, it lets you cast cheap spells again from your graveyard. And then finally, possibly the best one, given enough time, is Whirlwind of Thought. Again, art of Narset, just kind of dancing around. 1 blue, red, white. So 4 mana total for a rare enchantment that is pretty simple. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, draw a card. And you are playing the deck that has a bunch of non-creature spells. So if you like drawing cards every time you cast something, this is the enchantment to do it. Very similar to the Unpredictable Cyclone, where you kind of have to take a turn off to play this, and then you just need to make sure you don't die, and you're going to out-card advantage your opponent very, very easily. So these are Jeskai cards that aren't necessarily geared towards the Spell Matters deck. They are more towards a 3-color deck. They want you to be in 3 colors, but you are going to splash these quite often when you are in blue-red. So try to be a blue-red base with these cards and splash white as the tertiary color in your deck. And that's going to go ahead and do it for those archetypes. So the Cyclone archetype, the Spell Matters archetype are in the books. Let me know if this helped in any way, shape, or form. You can comment below. You can let me know on Twitter at MTG_Manarocks. But I hope this has been informative and helpful for the Ikoria drafts that you're going to be doing coming up. And yeah, remember to stay tuned to the channel for more videos like this. We'll be going over additional archetypes until we cover all of the main archetypes, probably doing the Mutate archetype next. Mostly the Sultai colors, and then we still definitely want to talk about graveyard decks, and we want to talk about human decks in this format, and then we'll probably wrap it up there. So be on the lookout for at least 2 to 3 more videos in this series. I'll have them all out hopefully by the time pre-release starts on Friday. And again, thanks for watching. My name's Timothy with Manarocks. I'll see you all next time.